Why don't we get started? I'll start with a bit of an introduction and we'll get to the speakers in just 2 or 3 minutes. So, my name is Simon Guthrie. I live here in Kitchener, Ontario, and I'm the critic for Democratic Reform for the Green Party of Canada. Thank you to everyone for being here tonight to talk about electoral reform in Canada. Our three panelists, Adrian Currie, Dave Meslin, and Joanne Roberts, are going to share some of the history of voting in Canada, the motivations for reform, and some of the directions that we could choose. Dennis Pilon was looking forward to joining us tonight, but for family reasons is unable to be here. We wish him all the best, and we look forward to a future opportunity to engage with him. We also have four delightful staff members who are making this event happen from the background: Aminata, Anthea, Bridget, and Randy. Thank you to all of you. This town hall couldn't possibly happen without all of you participating. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you tonight from the Haldimand Tract, land granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. This is land that was promised in 1784, land that was meant to support a people who had been displaced, and land whose history continues to shape relationships and responsibilities today. Because we're gathering online, I also want to recognize that each of you is joining from a different place. Those places have their own nations, treaties, histories, and living communities. Wherever you are, I invite you to recognize the Indigenous peoples who have cared for and relied upon those lands since long before Canada existed, and who continue to care for them now. As we turn toward a conversation about electoral reform, it's important to remember that the systems we work with today were never designed with Indigenous peoples in mind. They were imposed on top of existing political orders, governance systems rooted in accountability, reciprocity, and collective responsibility. Many of those traditions, whether Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Coast Salish, Mi'kmaq, or others, offered ways of making decisions that emphasized listening, relationship building, and shared stewardship. Those systems weren't perfect, but they were profoundly deliberative and grounded in the consent of the people. When we speak about changing our electoral system, we're not only talking about mechanics and models. We're talking about who gets to participate, whose voices are taken seriously, and how decisions affect the well-being of the whole community. Canada's democratic deficit isn't just a matter of seat counts or distorted outcomes. It's also the long history of excluding Indigenous peoples from the systems that govern their lives, even as those systems were built on their lands. So as we explore what a better voting system might look like, I hope we can bring a spirit of humility to the conversation. I hope we can learn from governance traditions that have always existed here. Those traditions remind us that leadership is relational, that decisions carry responsibilities, and that consent matters. And I hope that any reforms we imagine move us closer to a democracy that truly reflects all the peoples who share these lands. Now, let me give you a rough overview of how this town hall is going to proceed tonight. We have three brilliant panelists, and each is going to speak for about 15 minutes in the first part. After each, I may have some questions to dig into what they've said. After all three have spoken, we'll open up for questions and comments from you, the audience. It's not going to be an open mic style of Q&A. Instead, our staff will be watching the Q&A tab in the Zoom meeting. Put your content there and it'll get to me. Et je suis désolé, la session de ce soir n'est pas bilingue, à l'exception de notre panéliste Adrian. Si vous avez des questions ou des commentaires en français, veuillez les poster dans l'onglet Q&A. Je vais les poser au panel et inviterai une réponse en français ou en anglais. I hope that sounds like a plausible way to get through this town hall. I'm really looking forward to it. So why don't we get started? Our first speaker is Adrian Currie. Adrian's a community activist, committed environmentalist, and voting system reform advocate. Based in Ontario, he has worked on climate and energy policy, active transportation, and proportional representation, and has written about how electoral reform could make life in Ontario fairer and more affordable. Adrian, if you would take it from here.
Thank you, Simon. I appreciate the introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight and taking time out of your busy schedules to hear about electoral reform in our town hall. So why am I interested in electoral reform? Well, I've been a member of the Green Party for a number of years now, and I had the pleasure of sitting on the federal council, and I ran in 2021 in the riding of Davenport. What I noticed from this election was just how stacked the system was in favor of the Liberals and the Conservatives. So when I applied to grad school a couple of years ago, I made a conscious attempt to focus on voting system reform and electoral reform. So over the last 2 years, I've been doing some research and doing a lot of studying, and I learned that political interference is a reason why we don't have voting system reform in the last 100 years or so that Canada has been in existence. Um, it's voting system reform has been on the agenda for many years. It's been discussed federally and provincially, but nothing substantive has happened. So I'm here now to share with you some of what I've learned and what we're trying to do about it. So first and foremost, the system that we have is called the single plurality system, otherwise known as first past the post. Basically, the person in a riding that gets the most votes wins that riding, and then the party that gets the most ridings will win the election. However, with first past the post, a majority is not necessarily a majority. If you get to 46% of the vote, which is more than anybody else, you win the riding. Even if you get 36% of the vote, you would win the riding. That's not a majority. And what we found over time is that this causes some disturbances in our political system with lopsided elections and representation that is not fair from coast to coast to coast. So we can do better and we need to do better. We need a broader representation in Parliament and specifically on the committees where decisions are made. If we had some sort of proportional representation, you would get a broad representation from the Liberals, the Conservatives, the Greens, the NDP, the Bloc, and even the Maxime Bernier's People's Party. What that means is that people would sit down, hash out our problems, try to come to consensus, and find solutions that are acceptable to everyone. Um, Canada has changed. It's way more diverse than it was 100 years ago. There are way more people from different parts of the world with different interests and different motivations. And it's time that we have a voting system that represents this diversity so we can make decisions more equitable and fair for everyone. And we can solve some of the many intractable problems that we have, such as climate change, housing, social justice issues, and even political problems. So, from my perspective, voting system reform is the key to proportional representation. Now, we've learned, or I've learned, that the political parties do not have the main political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, they don't have an interest in changing the political system because right now the first past the post system benefits them. So, what options do we have in terms of changing our political system and changing our voting system? Well, one option is through the courts. Right now, there's a charter challenge that's ongoing. It's led by Fair Vote BC. They had a day in court in the Ontario Court of Appeal sometime last year, and they lost their case, unfortunately. But they've recently applied for leave to the Supreme Court of Canada to argue their case in an appeal. Now, this is exciting because there's a chance that this could win. It may not win right now, but we're trying to lay the groundwork that at some point in the future we could have a court, we can have the federal party, we can have we can have the Supreme Court of Canada make a decision where they would vote, in favor of some sort of voting system reform, so we can have a better and a more fair political system. Um, just to touch base on that, the section of the charter that Fair Vote Canada and Fair Vote BC is using is section 15 of the charter, which is basically that the discrimination should not exist and they should be eliminated. And they're using an analytical framework called the substantive equality argument. We can get into that later, but just to give you an idea of what they're trying to argue. Another another situation that they're trying to use is the Work and Family Coalition to challenge the Elections Finance Act, which is using Section 3 of the Charter, basically saying that voters' rights are undermined and meaningful participation is being compromised because of the unfair access to funds that certain political parties have in the lead up to election times. The details are a bit more in the weeds, but we won't get into that right now. So what are the motivations for electoral reform, specifically voting system reform? Well, we know that we would have fair representation if all parties were had a chance to put forward different candidates in different ridings. If we had multiple candidates in different ridings, you would have representation from women, from people from racialized communities, from different social groups and different marginalized groups, instead of just the usual status quo. We've noticed that there's considerable amount of hyper-partisanship in Parliament right now, where parties are seeming to score political points by arguing question period and not working together to solve the issues that we have. Similarly, we've seen that there's some lopsided elections in the past. One thing we've noticed in the last six elections, five out of the six elections have been minority governments. And right now we see that Mark Carney and the Liberals had to work with the Green Party, with Elizabeth May, in order to pass the budget. That's an example of what would happen if we had some sort of proportional representation where the party with the most seats did not have a majority, but would have to reach out across the aisles to different political parties to come up with compromises in order to pass legislation, which would, give MPs and different members of parliament a chance to weigh in to represent the people who vote for them. So, knowing this, we know that we can do much better. For example, almost all the European countries use some form of proportional representation. New Zealand also uses proportional representation. And of an interesting fact, out of the 30 OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation Development countries that use PR, only three don't use some form of proportional representation: the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. So, as we've seen to the south of us, we know that we have to have some sort of representation and fair representation from our political parties. We see what President Trump and the Republican parties are doing to the country, hyperpartisanship, um, just making decisions that are not benefiting the populace, such as tariffs and other instances where they're making decisions on the fly, not consulting Congress, and not looking out for the interests of everyone. Here in Canada, we don't want that to happen. We would like fair representation where everybody has a chance to say what happens in Parliament, what happens in government, so we can get the decisions to solve the problems that we have. One bit of light at the end of the tunnel, as we've seen recently with the election of Zoran Mandami in New York City, um, there is a bit of hope. We know that the Democratic Party used ranked ballots to decide their primary, and that gave someone such as Zoran Mamdani, who's a socialist, the opportunity to put forward issues that matter to people, which was basically looking out for the most vulnerable. Affordability was the number one issue that was on people's minds, and basically, it put the billionaires on notice. The billionaires like to think that they're in control of our society, and in that sense, the electoral system right now benefits them. But what we've learned is that austerity is not a way to run a city, a province, or a country. We need to look after the most vulnerable. We need to look after working families and working people, and having a more fair voting system will allow for a more representative parliament, and therefore we could have more buying for more people. So, on that note, I'd like to end my section and hand it over to Simon, who will introduce uh, um, our next panelist and then take some questions.
Thanks, Adrian. Just before I pass it along to the next speaker, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the representation you were mentioning in your comments. And I feel like you talked about it from two different perspectives. You talked about it at the individual level and at a collective level. Um, how does a proportional representation improve representation of women, of visible minorities, of indigenous peoples? How does that follow from proportional representation? And then at the other end, if I can ask two questions at the same time, you mentioned the People's Party of Canada, for example. There is often concern about welcoming them into the legislature. And I wonder if you have any thoughts in response to that concern about proportional representation.
Okay, so to answer the first part of your question, with some form of proportional representation and how women and people from racialized communities can get more representation, if we have a system such as mixed member proportional, for example, you would have more than one elected official in each riding. So right now it's one person per riding who gets to win. The political parties then would choose the best candidate to run an election based on the chances of winning. If you had a system such as mixed member proportional, you would have multiple candidates. So a political party such as the Greens, for example, would be able to choose a woman, maybe a person of a color, maybe someone from an underrepresented community, such as the LGBTQ two plus community, and then you'd have better options for people, more opportunity for people to choose a candidate based on their preferences and based on their interests when it comes to politics, the economics, or social justice issues. And in terms of representation, what makes it representative is that in a mixed member proportional system, for example, you would have two choices. You would choose a local representative, and then based on the number of votes that you get in the popular vote, the party which would get to balance out their seats in parliament based on the proportion of the votes that they get. So if they got 20% of the vote, then they would get 20% of the seats. And if they were able to elect, if they only elected, let's say, 10 people, then there would be another 10 that would be chosen from a list. So they would get 20 seats based on 20% of the vote. So that's how women, for example, and people from racialized communities would have a better option to be represented in Parliament. The second question is how would parties, fringe parties, or parties such as Maxime Bernier's People's Party, what would happen if they were to get elected into the House of Commons? Well, research has shown that fringe parties, they do get the chance to get represented in Parliament, but then they're often shunned by the status quo in the sense that if their policies are too extreme, then the main parties will not invite them into the coalition. So if they're, let's say they want rhinoceroses to run freely on the streets of Toronto, which would cause serious issues, social health issues, for example, then the NDP or the Bloc Québécois or the Liberals will say, you know what, that's a bit too extreme. We're not going to invite you to join our coalition. So then the extremist parties. They may get a chance to be elected, but then if their policies are too far out there, they're not going to be able to govern and to set policy. So that is a safeguard in the system, and we've seen in Germany and different parts of Europe that yes, you may have some fringe parties being elected, and they may get a chance to get their chance the chance in the sun in the limelight. But when it comes down to governing, they often don't have the chance to set policy and to govern.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A function, so we're getting some questions already. Please keep them coming. And I see one that's specific to what you were talking about around the court challenges earlier. And the question comes from Jim Collins, and he asks, "What do you think will be the government response to a successful court action?" You talked about Section 15 of the Charter. Is this something that's vulnerable to a notwithstanding rebuttal?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, Section 15 is vulnerable to the notwithstanding clause. However, Section 3 is not. So that's where the Working Families Coalition argument is a great opportunity to get some substantive change. If a court were to say that citizens' rights were not being respected because of the Elections Financing Act, then there isn't an opportunity for the government in power to use a notwithstanding clause, and they would be encouraged, if not forced, to change the voting system based on the judge's ruling, based on the court's ruling.
Thanks, Adrian. I think we're going to move on to Dave, but don't go anywhere because I suspect there will be some more questions and conversation coming your way. So, our next speaker is Dave Meslin. Dave is a community organizer, a best-selling author. He's the founder of Unlock Democracy Canada and the Ranked Ballot Initiative of Toronto. He's launched campaigns and organizations to strengthen local democracy, promote ranked ballots, and help people see themselves as active participants in political change. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Simon. And big thank you to the whole team from the Green Party who pulled this together. It's what we need to be doing. We need to be discussing this topic as much as we can, bringing more people into the movement, doing as much education as we can so we all understand the topic and we understand both the problems and the solutions. So thanks for organizing this, and it's an honor to be sharing the virtual stage with Adrian and Joanne. I agreed with everything Adrian said, except for his comment about rhinoceroses. I would totally support having rhinoceroses or rhinoceri on our streets. So I want to, oh, I've got to start my timer. Otherwise, I'll go on for hours, if not days. And thank you, of course, to all of you for tuning in. Okay, I want to try and do a quick kind of primer on voting systems, building on some of the content that Adrian shared. There's lots of different ways to look at voting systems, to categorize them. I find the most helpful framing is to look at it as three voting systems. Three categories of voting systems. There's dozens and dozens of voting systems, but three categories make sense to me. And this is based on 25 years of being an advocate of voting reform, working on four referendum campaigns in two provinces. Two of those campaigns lost, two of them won. Researching a book about democracy, which was then adapted into a recent TV show on TV Ontario called Unrigged. So through all that experience, I like explaining the topic as three categories. The first category, as Adrian said, is first past the post. It's a pretty funny name for a voting system because there's literally no post to pass. We'll get to that later. Adrian mentioned that in the OECD, there's only three countries that use first past the post: UK, US, and Canada. But we're actually the only member out of the entire OECD that uses first past the post universally for all elections coast to coast. So in the US, for example, first past the post is very rare for municipal elections. They use majoritarian ranked ballots for mayor, for councilors. They use it now for primaries, etc. And I think Maine's even doing it for their state elections. Was it Maine? I think so. And in the UK, they use proportional representation for their EU seats when they were part of the EU, and they also use ranked ballots for their mayors. So in terms of countries, major, modern Western democracies that use first past the post for all their elections, it's just Canada. Like we are the fringe of the fringe of the fringe. And the reason no one uses it, including our own parties, by the way, all of Canada's parties, orange, red, green, blue, you name it, none of them use first past the post to elect their own leaders or their candidates. Even in the House of Commons, when they're choosing the Speaker of the House, they don't use first past the post. So it's really funny how they would never use it for themselves, but they make us use it. Let me give you some reasons why people don't use first past the post, why it's such a crappy voting system. In fact, before I do that, let me state that I don't even consider it to be a voting system. So if I was to rank, the quality of voting systems on a scale of 0 to 10, I wouldn't put first past the post on the scale. It doesn't even deserve a zero. It's a very expensive exercise of arbitrary outcomes. It's almost randomization. You could throw a dart and maybe end up with a more accurate result. It's literally not a voting system because every voting system has some kind of built-in mechanism that strives to achieve a certain type of outcome. And mathematically, it doesn't always work. There's no perfect voting system, but some voting systems strive for a majority, some strive for a proportional outcome. First past the post literally strives for nothing, and it achieves nothing. And these are, so mathematically, it's garbage. It often gives us the wrong winner. So I live in Ontario, for example. In our last provincial election, we had a chance to pick blue, red, orange, or green. The majority of the province did not want blue, did not vote blue, and somehow blue got a majority. Like it's literally the opposite of what the province said. So math is bad, wrong winner. As Adrian pointed out, diversity is terrible under first past the post. Canada ranks way behind other modern Western democracies in terms of women, people of color, LGBT, you name it. And, Simon asked why. There's lots of reasons why. And to be honest, we don't fully understand all those reasons. I could try and offer some of them, but the statistics are clear. The countries with the highest level of women representation, gender balance, and BIPOC, they're all countries that use PR, like hands down. We could go into the details of why, but it doesn't really matter. The point is the stats show that that's the outcome. So let's do it. So you've got bad math, wrong winner, lack of diversity. Strategic voting is one of the worst elements of first past the post. And this doesn't exist in other countries. Like it's not a thing. The phrase doesn't exist. It would have no meaning. And again, if you explained our voting system to someone in Europe, they would look at you like you're crazy. Like if I said, hey, we just had an election and the vast majority of voters rejected the government that was in, but they won a majority anyways, they would look at me like, what are you talking about? Same thing with strategic voting. If I said, like, I really love the pink party, but I voted purple, they'd be like, what? Why'd you do that? And I'd be like, well, under our system, if you vote for this, it can actually help that, even though you wanted this. And again, they would look at you like you're from another planet. Negative campaigning, first past the post, rewards, incentivizes negative campaigns, which feeds polarization, hostility, which turns away more and more voters. It erodes, the probability of actually having healthy dialogue, like people actually talking about policy issues. And lastly, it doesn't provide very much choice. In fact, first past the post really drives you towards a two-party system. The US being like the clearest example of that, where it's literally a two-party system, like no other parties are essentially allowed, which is bordering on dictatorship. Some fascist countries only have one party, and the US is like, well, we'll add one more, but that's it. We're lucky here. We have three or four in the legislature, and on your ballot, you'll have another 10 or 15. We do have a lot of, fringe parties who are allowed to run, but they're always accused of being the spoiler. This ties back to the strategic voting. So what happens is over time, parties are encouraged to merge. And the right wing of the spectrum has done a really great job of like shutting down fringe, not fringe, breakaway parties. So Preston Manning is like, I'm going to start a new conservative party. And he does it. And then a few years later, they're like, we really have to merge. So they merge back. Wild Rose in Alberta, we're going to start a new party, more choice, more names on the ballot. This is good. It shouldn't just be left and right. It should be this and this and this. And that party merged again too. And there's always pressure on the NDP, Liberal, and Greens to merge because of vote splitting. And that would be terrible. That would be terrible. We need choice. I think we need way more choice than we have already. And you need to know that any party you vote for, you are helping that party. You vote for pink, you vote for purple, blue, green, whatever, beige. A vote for beige helps elect a beige MP. So that's first past the post. It's what we have now. Again, it's garbage. It's not even a voting system, and it creates all these negative side effects. Okay, watching my time. Okay. The second category I want to talk about is the one Adrian touched on, proportional representation, PR for short, and it is hands down the gold standard for any voting system. In fact, it's almost a synonym for election or for democracy. All it means, this isn't a radical statement, all it means that the outcome should be proportionate to what people voted for, which is kind of the whole point of having an election. I mean, like anything that doesn't do that is kind of messed up, right? So people will talk about PR as if it's some crazy idea, some radical idea. Adrian mentioned that, it's often accused of leading to extremism and all this stuff, but it's literally just an election. A proportional election is a proper election. The outcome of any election in any context, in any place, should be somewhat tied to how people voted. There are different ways of having proportional outcomes. The most extreme version, like a purely proportional system, has no ridings at all. There's no one representing a geographic area. It's just a list of names chosen by the members of a party. So if I'm a member of the Beige Party, and let's say there's 100 seats in the legislature, and the Beige Party gets 17% of the vote, we get 17 seats. If I'm ranked number 15 or 16 on the Beige list, I am now a member of parliament. It's a cool system proportionally. It gives you the most accurate outcome proportionally, but it's kind of crappy because people like ridings. We're used to ridings. People have become very accustomed to the idea that there's someone who they can call or go to the office and say, I'm your constituent, you represent my riding, and I want you to know this, or I want to ask for this. So that brings us to hybrid models. Hybrid models are really cool. They maintain geographic ridings, but add some element of proportionality or semi-proportionality. And the two main versions that are really the only two that have been talked about realistically in Canada are called MMP, mixed, which is mixed member proportional, and STV, the single transferable vote. I learned about MMP in 2009 when Ontario had a referendum on proportional representation. And the recommendation for MMP came from a randomly selected citizens' assembly. And they chose MMP for Toronto, sorry, not for Toronto, for Ontario. And then we had a province-wide referendum on it. The province decided, I think intentionally, as Adrian pointed out, the parties have been sabotaging reform efforts for decades. The province decided not to send out any educational materials about MMP or why the Citizens Assembly recommended it. So people went to the polls with this question on the ballot saying, should we change our system to MMP? And the vast majority of voters had no idea what that question even meant. There was very little public discourse about it. So we lost that referendum. A few years later, Ontario was 2007. In 2009, I flew to British Columbia and spent a couple months there working on their referendum, which was for STV. STV stands for single transferable vote. It uses a ranked ballot, but in a proportional model. It's very cool. MMP and STV are both amazing systems. They work in very different ways. We can get into the details if you'd like in the question period. That referendum we also lost. There was a very strong no campaign, and they used tactics against us that were very effective. So we lost, which is crappy, but it taught me a lot about STV. I am agnostic between those two systems. Which one's better? I would take any of them in a heartbeat. The third category I want to touch on, and I'll touch on it quickly because I'm running out of time because I blabber on and on. The third category, we've talked about first past the post, which is the mathematical term for that is plurality. And the second category was proportional, where every vote counts. And the third category is kind of in between. It's a majority system where it strives to ensure that the majority of voters get what they want, which means, for example, in Ontario, just because I've used this example a few times, if a majority of Ontarians didn't want the Conservatives, then the Conservatives wouldn't win, right? Which is kind of the basic premise of democracy. That's how Robert's Rules works. It's how motions work in a council chamber, the House of Commons. the majority wins. Like that's the thing. That's the foundation upon which our democracy is based. So a majority system is really cool. And I'll just say quickly that it's not better in terms of proportionality. In fact, in some cases it can be worse. So on that measure, it's not great. But on all the other things I mentioned, lack of choice, wrong winner, diversity, strategic voting, negative campaigning, more choice, it excels in all of those in incredible ways. So it's important to recognize those three categories because that middle category of majority voting with a 50% threshold, that's what I mean when I say majority. And again, this is how our parties elect their leaders. Like you need 50% to win. You can't win with 15%, 20%, 45%. So the reason that category is important is because there are disagreements in the movement about whether switching from first past the post to a majority system with a 50% threshold is something that we should strive for or see as a stepping stone towards PR. It is my belief that it is a really important tactic that we should be using on the path towards PR. And I think that if we had started advocating for ranked ballots and majority systems 20 years ago when this movement got off the ground, I think we would have proportional representation now. But by always going for the gold and trying to skip that middle step from first past the post all the way to PR, I think we're sentencing ourselves to an eternity of first past the post. And London, Ontario, the City Council of London, Ontario, in 2018 became the first government anywhere in Canada in my lifetime to ditch first past the post. They switched to a majority ranked ballot model, and I thought that was historic and amazing, and helps us get closer to PR. One more last sentence. I know I'm out of time, but one more sentence. Um, the most common attack used to discredit PR is that it leads to instability and extremism. And we can go into it later in the Q&A, but it is absolutely false. And I would argue that it's actually an inversion of reality. It is first past the post that delivers instability and extremism. And the United States is a great example of how first past the post does nothing to isolate or reduce extremism. And if you're looking at instability, I can give you tons of examples across Canada of first past the post delivering political instability. So that's it. Thank you for your time. Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Dave. That was a lot, and every bit of it was appreciated. I wanted to pick on a couple of things that you said, and why don't I start with the last thing you talked about in London, Ontario. Um, Most Canadians have at least three levels of government above them. Here in Ontario, municipal elections and municipal councils are ostensibly nonpartisan. Candidates don't run on a party ticket, they don't run as party slates. With a PR system, would you lose the independent candidate? And if you do, is there a loss?
Holy moly. That is a very complex question. And yeah, I'll try and give an answer that isn't complex because it would take time. Um, there are ways to implement proportionality without parties. And it's kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes because we talk about PR usually in terms of parties. So 10% vote green, Greens should get 10%. Another way of looking at it, though, is issue based. So you could also say that if 10% of a municipality, if 10% of voters in a municipality support having a rhinoceros on the street, then 10% of the council should end up with councillors who want rhinoceros on the streets. It doesn't have to be based on parties, right? Um, it's illegal in Ontario to have parties, a council. Um, there's no funding mechanisms in place to create riding associations or to raise or spend money in between elections. So it's hard to answer your question, but let me just say that at a partisan level, provincially or federally, with MMP or STV, I think it would actually increase the chance of independents winning a seat for different reasons in each model. But municipally, let me just say this. Municipal is where we should be putting all of our focus, in my humble opinion. I think all good change starts at the local level. And if you look historically, and I think Joanne's maybe going to touch on this a bit, if you look at the other historical changes we've seen, like women getting the vote or things like that, it all started at the municipal level. And to try and answer one other part of your question, I like that Ontario doesn't have parties at the municipal level. I think it would be a shame to introduce parties at the local level. And even though people know that, this counselor is an NDP or this counselor is a liberal, no one is whipping their votes. Every counselor in Toronto City Council, they vote any way they want. There is no whip. And nothing could be further from that in the House of Commons, where every MP is told how to vote on every vote. We essentially don't have a legislature. So I love the fact that Ontario's municipal councils don't have party whips, don't have parties.
Thanks, Dave. I think we'll let you catch your breath. I see a few questions coming in that sure look like they have your name written all over them, so we will be calling on you shortly. But for now, let's move on to our third panelist, and that is Joanne Roberts. Joanne is an award-winning journalist, political consultant, and former interim leader of the Green Party of Canada. Her recent book, Storm the Ballot Box, has taken her across the country, speaking to Canadians about electoral reform and inspiring them to get excited about voting and to demand a better democracy. Joanne has not shared her position on rhinoceroses in the streets. Maybe she will. You're up, Joanne.
Oh, I love the idea of rhinoceroses in the street. Um, you know, this is a really personal topic for me. Um, and I know it is for Dave and Adrian as well. A shout out to Dave. Dave was an inspiration for my own book, and I worked with Adrian, um, especially when I was interim leader. And I tell you, they've set me up perfectly. But why is it so personal? Well, I left journalism and decided to run as a Green Party candidate in 2015 in Victoria. And I hope some of the folks who made that campaign so much fun are listening to today. Um, and it was great. I mean, I loved that campaign. I was totally naive, had thought I knew politics inside out because I'd covered it for 40 years as a journalist. And then I became a candidate and discovered what it was really about. So when it was all said and done, and they counted the ballots, 23,666 people had voted for me. 33% of the people who voted for me. If I get a tattoo, that's the number it's going to be. I had more votes than 131 MPs who were elected that night. 131 MPs had fewer votes than I did, but I lost. I came second. And it was devastating. Tom Mulcair got less votes than I did. He got 19,000, if you want to know. So there's some things about this that are just plain personal for me. That 2015 election, Elizabeth May, who had convinced me to run, was running in the riding next to me. She was the only Green returned to the House of Commons. And it was a great campaign for Greens across the country. We actually ran a pretty fulsome campaign. And Elizabeth was convinced she would have some support in the House, but she didn't have it. And it was hard for her to go back. But it was hard for another reason for Greens across the country. I checked the numbers last night. 603,000 people, so 4% of the population who voted Green. And they got one representative. The 800,000, so 4.6%, voted for the Bloc Québécois, and they got 10 seats. And so it became pretty clear to me when I woke up the day after the 2015 election that this was totally unfair. But I had hope. I woke up feeling, oh my gosh, this is great because we heard Justin Trudeau say 1,200 times this would be the last election under first past the post. So I thought to myself, in the next election, I won't have to deal with strategic voting because strategic voting was the enemy I could not defeat. I mean, I could debate the Murray Rankin who won, the New Democrat. I could debate the Liberal. The Conservatives, of course, never showed up for any debates, but I could not debate strategic voting, and that's what defeated me in the end. So we all know how that ended. It didn't end well, and I think Dave Meslin talked about why that didn't end well. Because in the end, Justin Trudeau never said we'd have proportional representation. I went back and did a media survey because we all thought he said that, but he didn't. What he said is this will be the last election under first past the post. And what he meant was, I want to go to a ranked ballot or, as Dave was saying, a majority system. And I must admit, I often lay awake at night and wonder what would have happened if we had decided, if the committee, the Electoral Reform Committee, had gone ahead and been able to recommend a ranked ballot. And instead of deciding just to throw, Canadians no longer want electoral reform. Isn't that what we were all told? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what do we do instead. And one of the things that I feel strongly about is that we need to lower the voting age. And you're going, well, Joanne, we're here talking about voting systems, electoral reform. But what we have seen in our history is when we are more inclusive of who votes, we have a better chance of improving our system. And I was very struck, Simon, by your land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy and the Maliseet. And it's embarrassing to say as a Canadian, but First Nations in our country did not get the right to vote till 1960. 1960. I think a lot of us were around in 1960. This isn't ancient history. They could vote when the Indian Act was first introduced back, in 1876. They were allowed to vote if they gave up their status as Indians. I mean, I didn't have to give my status as a woman up to be able to vote. But then again, I wasn't able to vote until 1918, because that's when women were allowed to vote in this country. And we were allowed to vote as women, but only if we owned property. There's something that we forget, that in order to vote in this country, you had to own property. Even men, when they first were allowed to vote, because they were the guys we wanted to vote, but they had to own property. And they had to be 21. And then we decided, okay, we'll let women vote, but not without a fight. I mean, I wish I had been a suffragette. I love that fight. And believe me, I am far from being 16, but I am going to join those 16-year-olds to make sure they get the right to vote. Because, 1918 women vote. 1948, we allowed Asian Canadians to vote. 1950, we gave the Inuit back the vote. And here's the other thing about lowering the voting age. We treat it like we've never lowered the voting age in this country. We lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Took us 40 years to do it. But here's the thing. During World War II, we allowed 18-year-olds to vote because we didn't think it was fair. We should put them out to die for the country if we wouldn't let them vote for the country. And now I think about what we are saying to 16 and 17-year-olds. We're asking you to take a look at the world we're leaving you and have no say in what we do about it. And so I'm really wound up about 16-year-olds being able to vote. So I'm going to take the rest of time I have here because my two colleagues have done a great job of setting us up about electoral reform. But I think my biggest worry right now is Canadians are losing faith in our democratic system. 11 million Canadians did not vote in our last federal election. 11 million Canadians, even an election that a lot of people turned out because we were all worried about Trump and Polyev and all of that. and we had a higher turnout than we've had for a while. We didn't break 70%, which was our traditional spot. We were down around 67, 68%. And that was a good turnout. I mean, you talk about your election in Ontario, and I helped work that election. You didn't even get 50% of the voters to turn out, let alone elect Doug Ford and give him a false majority. You couldn't even get half your population to vote. And I'm not going to point my finger at you because the same thing happened in Nova Scotia. Tim Houston was returned with a supermajority, and less than 50% of the population eligible to vote voted. So I am really concerned that we're actually going to lose democracy just by attrition, that people are just giving up, and it is not in the interest of the two major political parties to get more people to vote. And those of us who work in elections know why that is. Because the two major political parties know how the majority of people who vote, how they vote. It's only a few swing ridings across this country where they know that the vote is close enough to swing it one way or another. That's who they care about. They don't care about the people who don't vote because they have no idea what those people will do. And I suspect it is the same about why they're not pushing to lower the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, because history will show us that 16 and 17-year-olds in countries where they do vote, and the UK has agreed that 16-year-olds can vote in their next election. There are a number of countries now, Scotland and Wales and Austria, Brazil, Argentina, where we already have 16 and 17-year-olds voting, and they've done some good research. They've shown the outcome doesn't change, the turnout changes. So teenagers are like the majority of the population. They have different opinions and they vote for different parties. But what we would be creating if we lowered the voting age is we would be raising voters. And right now, the lowest cohort of voters are the 18 to 24-year-olds. In our last election, where I said we had a pretty good turnout, 46.7% of 18 to 24-year-olds who were eligible voted. That's less than half. You know who the big turnout comes from? The 65 to 74-year-olds. Let's hear it. We turn out 75%. And you know what? We're dying off. Like, once we're gone, you've lost a whole generation of voters. And this new generation of voters is not voting. And the statistics and the research are pretty good that if you don't vote in the first election you're eligible to vote in, you're unlikely to vote in any other election thereafter. So I've got 4 minutes left. I, I think that what's important about that is if we lowered the voting age to 16 and married that with really strong compulsory civics in their high schools so that we get young people to the ballot box when they're excited about elections and politics, and they've met a few politicians because politicians would then go to the schools. I think these young people would then say, well, I want my vote to count. And there's the sting. First past the post. Dave's right. First past the post is the worst system for making your vote count. A ranked ballot, and I know it's not perfect, and as a Green, I'd love to have PR, but at least a ranked ballot means that your vote will live on if the person you didn't have as your first choice doesn't win. Your vote gets in. Most of us have used a ranked ballot to elect leaders. And it is pretty hypocritical that all of the parties, including our own, use a ranked ballot to elect our leaders. We also allow 14-year-olds to vote. And so do the Liberals, and so do the Conservatives, and so do the NDP. Again, we think that we can have 14 and 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds vote for our leaders, but we're not going to let them vote in a general election. So, I mean, when we look at all the reasons that I've spent a whole book, right, looking at why people don't vote, but one of the main reasons is they do not feel their voices being heard. And, you know, I look at the Freedom Convoy, those big trucks and their big horns that went to Ottawa. The majority of those people, yes, there were some conspiracy theorists and people with a really anarchist agenda, but the majority of those people felt they weren't being heard by politicians. And you know, when I talk to people who don't vote, because that's the thing I'm on about right now. And I mean, I can remember knocking on doors and people going, I don't vote. And you go, well, why don't you vote? Because it doesn't matter. And I really think that we need to seriously in this country, if we do not want to lose our democracy, do not want to become a two-party state, we need to do more than just hang on forever until we get our gold standard. I think we need to have the discussion. Is there a halfway point? Is there a way to start moving towards that? And making changes is important. Lowering the voting age would be the first easy thing to do. Senator McFedrin has a bill before the Senate right now that has gone to second reading, Bill S-222. And if that were to suddenly give them the option, there is a court case. I'll go back to Adrian's point. There is a wonderful court case that's been slowly going through the courts, 13 young people. It's the Penny Crocker et al. Versus Canada. And they're arguing that all citizens have a right to vote, Section 13, and that also 3, and all citizens are created equal, Section 15. And there is a precedent that says if you're going to limit the right to vote, it must be clearly justified. Except for people under the age of 18, the only person in Canada who's not allowed to vote is the chief electoral officer. Even public servants are now allowed to vote. So, I mean, we have been changing our system slowly, but now I think we need to look at the fact that so many people feel disenfranchised, even those who have the right to vote. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we do now? And that's why I'm glad I'm on this panel. I'm glad we're having this discussion. I have 21 seconds left to say thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everyone at the Green Party who's fighting so hard for this, and for having all of you for coming out. It's remarkable to have 134 participants here listening to what we have to say. So thank you, Simon. Back to you.
Thank you, Joanne. Again, you packed an awful lot into a pretty short time. Um, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about Vote 16 or lowering the
Yeah.
voting age. The first one is you talked about some other countries that have lowered it. The UK recently
Mhm.
lowered it to 16. What was the motivation for those nations to lower the voting age? Why did they do it?
Well, they did it for two reasons. Two of the reasons we're facing. They were watching their population shrink. And they had a very active student groups that were pressuring the government. One thing I didn't say, nothing has ever changed in our voting system without protest, without real, like grassroots, even lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. As I said, it took 40 years. And if you remember the 70s, and some of us do, um, government felt that if it didn't do that, they were going to face, massive revolts in their ridings. So that's what happened in the UK. 16-year-olds ran a very good campaign and pressured their government. Um, and I think the government felt that they really couldn't defend themselves anymore. But hats off to the organizers. It was a very effective campaign.
All right. And a second question about lowering the voting age that comes from the Q&A section from Amber. We now have graduated licensing for driving that we didn't have in the 80s and before because 16-year-olds have poor judgment. Is their ability to vote intelligently different?
Yes, actually, I'm glad you asked that question because there have been psychological. In fact, I recently wrote a piece for the Toronto Star and I referred to it. I wonder if I can pull it up that fast. But they do have the cognitive ability to make the decision um, responsibly about who to vote for. And so it's not after the age of 14. It takes until you're 21 for it to fully form, but there's very little difference between 14 and 18 in your cognitive ability. But I do hear what you're saying there. I think the important part of that is to marry lowering the voting age with really good civics education. I think we've been so influenced by the American form of democracy that we need to balance that in our schools. We have a wonderful civics program, but it's not mandatory.
All right. It looks like we're about an hour in and we have got about a half an hour left. So why don't we start maybe getting into a bit of a lightning round here? I see Dave's got his hand up and maybe he's got something to add to that last question.
Yeah, I actually run the national campaign to lower the voting age. You should all check it out, vote16.ca. Agree with everything Joanne said. On that last question from Amber, I just wanted to mention that there's a distinction between cold cognition and hot cognition. So, hot cognition is when you have to make a decision in the spur of the moment, something is presented to you out of the blue. You might be influenced by peer pressure. Teenagers are really bad at hot cognition. Cold cognition is when you sit someone down, here's some options, take some time, think it over, let us know what you think. For cold cognition, 16-year-olds have the exact same capacity as an adult. You take away the peer pressure, you take away the spontaneity, 100% they can handle it.
Thanks, Dave. I knew that that was cold and hot was what I was trying to remember.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for answering what is an important question, but might sound a little bit spicy at first. But yeah, it is important. All right, we're really getting into the lightning round now. I'm going to try to scan through the Q&A section, find some interesting ones, and generally, I'm just going to put it out to the whole panel. If one of you really loves the question and wants to answer it, speak up quickly. So I'm going to start with one from Paul de Groot, and there isn't actually a question in here, but I'm going to try to formulate one as I read some of his comments. He says he applied the multi-member proportional system to the last federal election, so the one this year, comparing the results from first past the post to mixed member. And one of the most striking discoveries that Paul found was that the party that lost the most from first past the post was the Conservative Party of Canada, not a party that we usually associate with advocating for electoral reform or even benefiting from it. So I wonder if any of you might comment a little bit about why the different federal parties, at least, might be convinced to support electoral reform because, except for a certain party I could name that rhymes with Schmeen, they don't. So what do they have to gain? Sell it. Sell it to the parties.
I'll take a quick stab at this first. First of all, thanks for the question, Paul. Simulations are really hard to do. You take the data from one election and you try and apply it and say, what would have happened under a ranked ballot? What would have happened under MMP or STV? You can't really do that because you're using the data of people who voted under first past the post. So when we switch to a different system, everything changes. How many parties, how they campaign, how we vote, etc. So I would caution against reading too much into any simulation. In terms of how you could convince a party to support PR, I think I think the conservatives would actually be prime targets for persuasion, and the reason is this: the the Conservative Party is actually three or four parties combined into one, just like the NDP. And the Liberals to some extent. So every NDP leadership race is this battle between like the left part of the party and the right part of the party. And the Conservatives, have always had this fight between the progressive Conservatives, called like red Tories, and the more socially conservative ones. Under PR, all these parties could just fragment, which would be amazing. The NDP could split into groups of different degrees of socialism, and the conservatives could break off into people who are like anti-vax, pro-gun, anti-abortion landowners or whatever, and groups that are just like, oh, I'm totally liberal, but I think we should reduce the deficit. That would be amazing. And PR actually aligns with a lot of conservative foundational premises of a free market without cartels dominating, choice and choice driving innovation, and then people voting with their dollars, supporting startups and disruptors. That's what PR is. PR allows a more of a free market environment where new startups can emerge and people can vote for any party they want, and then disruptors can gain market share. So I think we can totally sell this to conservatives. In fact, they might be the most likely party to bring in reform because the NDP, I think, are crap on this issue. And I say that as a former NDP staffer.
Thanks, Dave. All right, next question. I'm going to paraphrase part of a question that we got in the Q&A. If the voting system changes, what support or education do you imagine would be needed to support voters or newcomers as they transition into this new voting system? How would we do that?
Well, I think Elections Canada is well set up to do that. I mean, when you look at the role of Elections Canada and the amount of work that they do to inform the public about how our voting system works, and I've spent a lot of time going through their material, they're well placed to walk people through it. And I think there would have to be um, government support for an education campaign. And to be honest, and I think this is important, is the political parties themselves would have to take on the role of ensuring that people understood what was going to happen. And I actually believe that's one of the drawbacks. It's one of the reasons we're not there yet, because political parties like that they know how the system works and they know how to make it work for them. And I mean, if you've ever sat in a room with campaign managers from different parties when an election is over and they're all just having a drink and talking about how they managed to win that seat or win that seat, you realize that there's a system based on the system. And, strategic voting it works because parties believe in it. If the system changes and all of those parameters change and it's going to take 2 or 3 elections for parties to figure it out, that's one of the reasons they don't want any change. So I believe that the change is made then because the public demands it, as we did in 2015. Like we had 3 political parties who all were running on electoral reform. 2015 was a perfect storm and it got blown out of the water. But I do believe that we have the ability in the country with Elections Canada and the political parties seeing it to their advantage to convince people how to do it.
Thank you. There's a question from Charles Marskoff. I hope I'm getting that at least close to how it's supposed to be pronounced. Can someone on the panel speak to what has been happening in France over the past couple of years? Is it a failure or downside to proportional representation, or is there more going on? Perhaps he's talking about the influence that Marine Le Pen has had on French elections. Any thoughts amongst the panelists?
I confess I don't watch French elections too closely, but I am aware that so they have a certain type of majority system for president in particular, which is very unique. So it's a majority system. You need 50% to win, but instead of going through a preferential ballot with a runoff, eliminating the candidate with the least, they go right to the top 2. So first, a bunch of people run, and then the top 2 go to a head-to-head battle. And obviously, in a 2-candidate race, the winner has a majority. So there have been times when, a kind of extreme-ish person comes in second in the first round, and then everyone freaks out. But I don't believe there's been an example where they have actually won, which is exactly the benefit of having a majority system. When the majority can reject someone who's extreme under first past the post, an extremist, unsupported by 80%, of the population can still win. So I would say that for at least for their presidential elections, it's great that they do a runoff. I believe for their legislature, the question might have been about the legislature where there's been some instability. They've been trying to pull together a coalition. I don't actually know what system they use to elect the legislature, so I can't comment on the connection between the voting system and their recent inability to form a stable coalition.
Thanks, Dave. And I see Joanne looks like she might have something.
Well, actually, I just have some news for everybody because I know everyone here cares about electoral reform. The BC All-Party Electoral Reform Committee has just reported back, and they are recommending a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. And the citizens' assembly in 2004 was very effective. I was there then and working as a journalist, so I covered a lot of it. And if it's again, I think this could have a possibility to see a province actually make a change. In 2004, there were 161 members of that assembly. They held 50 public hearings. They had 1,600 submissions, and they got 57.7% of the vote in favor of going to STV. And of course, we all know they had set the bar at 60%, so it just lost. But it was probably one of the best moves towards a PR form was that citizens' assembly. And boy, people were well informed when they came out of it. Anyway, it looks like they're going to do it again in BC, so maybe we'll all go out and see if we can get that one over the finish line.
It's too easy to be cynical about these sometimes. Oh, another recommendation. It'll never turn into anything. But I hope, and I hope that some of the audience shares in that hope that it's another opportunity to push towards a fairer electoral system. Dave, what have you got?
Yeah, just really quick comment here. It's coming back to my memory now. I believe France is the only European country on the mainland that doesn't use PR to elect their legislature. So the instability of their legislature could actually be a direct result of their not using PR. PR statistically, on average, leads to government coalitions that are more stable than what we currently have in Canada. PR delivers stability, the exact opposite of what its detractors claim.
Thank you. All right, I've got a question here from Sejal Bhargava. And his comment and question is, I love your perspective on lowering the voting age. It makes a lot of sense. I was wondering if you could all speak to the lack of engagement Canadians have in politics and democracy. A lot of people vote for a party and not on particular policy items. Is this something that can be improved with voting reform? Will it make democracy more participatory? I open it to anyone.
I can take a stab at that. Yes, it will make it more participatory because there won't be any negative campaigning, as Dave mentioned earlier. Um, because of the ranked ballots, let's say you have a ranked ballot system, whether it's STV or mixed member proportional, you want to be voters' second or third choice. So you're not going to sling mud and put down another candidate or the party because you want to encourage people to vote for you. So there's more positive campaigning. You're going to focus on the issues. You're going to focus on results, and then as a result, you're going to get better participation from voters because they're going to want to listen to what you have to say. So that's my short answer for yes, you get more participation.
Thanks, Adrian. Dave, did you want to add a bit to that? Oh,
Here we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, just a quick
perfect.
response. Sorry, give me a second. Now I've got this thing on my screen. Okay, hi. There are ways to boost engagement. I think there was a good part of that question where you made a distinction between voting for parties rather than voting for ideas. Lots of countries have a more of a culture of referendum. Referendums, I think, are really cool because you don't have to know the difference between blue, red, orange, and green. It's more concrete. It's like, here's an idea. What do you think? Should we do this or should we not do it? I'm a big fan of referendums. Not for all issues, not for human rights issues, for example, but on other issues, it would be great. Participatory budgeting is also a great way to get more people involved. It's a municipal thing where people vote directly on how government spending is organized at the local level. Two more quick things. In addition to in addition to expanding the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, I really support um, expanding voting rights to permanent residents. I think this is a really important issue in Canada. By definition, a permanent resident is permanent. They're here, they're living here, they're not tourists, they're paying taxes, they're sending their kids to school, and they can't vote right now. I think it's crazy. I think this is a really important social justice issue. And the last thing about this question is civics, civics, civics. We do such a terrible job of teaching civics in Canada. I think most people literally just don't understand how the system works. They're like provincial, federal, municipal, Senate, House of Commons, like I don't know, I don't get it. And then they don't vote. If you don't understand how something works, you're not likely to engage with it.
And we also, I'm just going to add to this, Simon. I know you want to move on to another question, but
No,
I'll keep
no,
it
no,
short.
go ahead.
I mean, there are some simple things on our current system that we could be doing to make our elections more exciting and to say to people, we want you to vote. Elections Canada actually proved it for me this time round because they had advanced voting on a holiday. And you know what? We had the highest voter turnout in the country on a holiday because people had the whole day off. So come on, that's an easy one. Let's make Election Day a holiday. Let's have free buses and transit for everyone to get there. And let's allow people to have barbecues and balloons and ice cream. I mean, why have we come to this conclusion that elections have to be boring? We offer no incentive. We don't say free hot dogs if you come to vote. We don't say we'll give you a day pass to the national parks if you vote. Like, we have done so little in this country to encourage people to vote. And it's time if we do nothing else and nothing comes out of this tonight, I hope we're talking to our MPs about it is time to make voting one of the most important things you do, and our electoral system should show that. Anyway.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question, even though I suspect all of our panelists could keep going about this. There have been a few questions in the Q&A around mandatory voting. Australia is the country that I think of when I hear mandatory voting, and that connects well with what Joanne has just been talking about around voting on holidays, because I believe Australia does that as well, that Election Day is a statutory holiday for them. So I wonder if any of you could speak to mandatory voting. Is this good? Is this problematic? Where do you land on it?
Um, so when I started my book, I knew there would be a chapter on mandatory voting because everybody, when you say voting reform, says, well, should we have mandatory voting? And I looked at the electoral reform, looked at mandatory voting, and they had submissions made. And the arguments are very good for mandatory voting. The timing is not. I just don't think Canadians would be willing to agree to mandatory anything, and that's what the Electoral Reform Committee came down to. But here's the one thing I love about mandatory voting, and that is you no longer have a get out the vote program. And of those of us who've been in campaigns know that the biggest part of a campaign is identifying the people who are going to vote for you and getting them out to vote. That's what we spend all our time doing. In Australia, you don't have to do that. So you talk about why you're the right person, what the issues are. You go door to door and you campaign differently. So I was very much, I don't think mandatory voting is a good idea, but I've switched my opinion on that. But I do not think Canada's ready for it. But I think there's lots to be said for mandatory voting.
Thank you. Adrian, I've got a question that's being directed straight to you. It's from Nira Dukaran. Adrian, you mentioned Zoran Mamdani's win. Can you connect his win to electoral reform discussions? I'm very interested in how he won and to what extent voter turnout and other factors impacted his win.
Okay, so the Democratic Party used a single transferable vote for their primary election. So, which is separate from the actual election of a couple weeks ago. So, what that meant is that it was a ranked ballot. So Zoran he's a democratic socialist. He ran on affordability, free transit passes, rent freezes, community grocery stores, issues that would make life more affordable and livable for many New Yorkers, and that resonated with a lot of people. So he campaigned on these issues, knowing that he just had to, get people to realize that this was an opportunity for them to live, to live better in the biggest city in North America in a sense. But what he did, or what the ranked ballot allowed for him, is to make friends with some of the other candidates. So so he and another candidate, I don't know his name, but they showed up at events together, and they supported each other, and they campaigned on certain issues. And when it came to the election, um, they said, hey, we're friends. A vote for him is a vote for me. If you want to, you can put me first and put him second, or put him first and put me second. Doesn't matter. We share the same issues, and we want to make life more affordable for you. So what that did is that it gave Mandami the opportunity to rank higher than his main competitor, which was I think Governor Cuomo. So that's how he won the primary. Now, because he won the primary, that gave him great momentum when it came to the actual election, and people were excited about the opportunity to have more affordable, more affordable city in New York City, um, and that this could be a game changer for them. A lot of people are struggling in New York because of the cost of living, the tariffs that the President Trump has pushed through. So that led to his victory, and it's an opportunity for other parties, continent wide, in the United States, in Canada, to follow that example, to say, hey, what, let's change our voting system, whether it's for the primary or whatever, to some sort of single transferable vote where you have, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have that negative campaigning. You can form coalitions, and you can support people, and you can campaign based on issues. Um, an example of this is that Dave mentioned London. I think it was was it 2009 or 2007? They had the ranked ballot voting. Um, one of the candidates that won, I forgot her name, but she decided to run. She was a person of color, a young black woman, 2018. She decided to run because of the fact that she didn't have to worry about negative campaigning. As a young black woman, she realized that, hey, I could just run based on the issues and I'll see what happened. Ariel Kayabaga. She decided to run based on the fact that, what, I'm just going to campaign on the issues. I don't care what people say. I'm going to let people vote and choose who they choose, and choose me if they wanted to. Well, she did such a good job that she won, and she got a seat on council. So that is an opportunity for Canadians and for Canadian municipalities and Canadian provinces, and for voters to say, what, this is a way to choose candidates. Why don't we move towards this?
Thanks, Adrian. I'm watching the time, and I think it's time that we start bringing this in for a landing. And so what I'm going to do is I've got one more question that came in from the Q&A, and so I'm going to ask it. It's from Ian Currie, but I'm also going to invite our speakers, and Joanne, you're going first. You can answer the question, and you can tie it into your last words for the evening. So your final message to the audience. And the question is this from Ian Currie. There are a lot of people in this call who are interested in voting reform. What are some actionable ways that people can contribute to help move Canada towards a PR system? That's the question. And give us your final words at the same time. Joanne, you're up first, and Dave, you're on deck.
Well, I think my pet project right now, and it's one of the things we can do, is support Senator McFedrin, who's working with Elizabeth May to see her bill S222 make it through the Senate. So that's something you can contact your senators. You can ask them to move this through. That will keep the question of who's voting and who's not alive. Fair Vote Canada is going to be looking for support, especially if you're in British Columbia. Make sure your name's in the lottery for the Citizens Assembly. Be willing to work, whether it's handing out leaflets, going door to door, talking about how do we change the system. But more than anything, and this I know for this group because we're committed, that I'm probably singing to the choir here, but I really think we need to say to the people in our lives who don't vote, and there's someone, because there's 11 million Canadians not voting, that the minute we give up on our vote, our democracy is weakened, no matter what system we vote with. I mean, I'm obviously want us to move past first past the post. And I'd like to see us move to a more progressive voting system. But I am very concerned that we will just lose our system because people will stop voting. So my last word is storm that ballot box. Go and take someone to vote the next time you have an opportunity. Make sure you tell your kids and your grandchildren that voting is important and our system is different than the United States. If we do not value it, we will lose it. So thank you to everyone who came tonight. And because it means you care about democracy, and there are not enough of us. Thank you.
Cool.
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go next. Thanks, Simon. So I'll wrap up by again thanking the Green Party of Canada, Simon, and everyone who helped organize this. This is exactly what we need to do. If to answer Ian's question, like how do we get to PR? It's this. So replicate this. Do this at your local church or synagogue or mosque. Do it at your local community center. Bring speakers into high schools. If you're part of a party, bring speakers into your local riding association, et cetera, et cetera. I want to say something really quickly about that question about, how do we get more people to vote? And I want to just bring this back to PR really quickly. PR, by giving us more choice and more parties on the ballot who can actually win seats, that will get more people voting. It's actually really boring to only have two parties who've ever held power in Canada. So an analogy I like to use is it's kind of like having an election where it's just VHS and Beta, or it's just Molson and Labatt's. Or sometimes I'll say, imagine Netflix with only two movies and they're both black and white from the 1940s. Who's going to subscribe to Netflix? So first past the post is one of the main reasons why people aren't voting, because it pushes us towards a two-party system, which is genuinely boring. And then one last quick answer for Ian. What is something actionable you could do? Join Fair Vote Canada, fairvote.ca. Join Unlock Democracy Canada, unlockdemocracy.ca. And check out a report that I wrote about London's experience. It's at londonleads.ca. London Leads, because they were leading. It's a report that explains how we got municipal voting reform in Ontario and how London actually switched away from first past the post and what the impact was. I think the most winnable type of reform we can push towards is municipal reform. So put that on your radar. Thanks.
All right, just before I invite Adrian, Joanne, you wanted to jump in about an event
Just
tomorrow
one
in
thing, they
Wolfville.
would never forgive me. Ian was asking things you could do. If you're in Nova Scotia tomorrow night in Wolfville, that's where Acadia is, at the Lions Hall from 7 till 9, there will be a panel much like this talking about democracy at risk. So yes, support these events, as Dave said so well. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Adrian, you get the last words. Well, except for my last words. So actionable ways that Canadians can affect change. And what's your final message to the audience?
Okay, so participation. And I always come back to this simple fact. If you look at me, you see that I'm a person of color. We're born in Jamaica, raised in Canada, and I've been here since the 70s, and we grew up in this very diverse, multicultural society. Canada is so diverse now. And because of that, we have different ways of thinking, different ways of thinking about how to run our economy, how to look after our elders, our social justice issues, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to trade. Two political parties just doesn't cut it anymore. And one thing that I've learned is that the first past the post system, the single plurality system, is designed for two parties. If you have two parties, you can get a majority sometimes. But well, you will actually get two parties. But if you have three, four, or five parties, you don't get a majority. You often don't get a majority. And that's the issue. Canada has changed. We're way more diverse. Let's just, let's join the 21st century. And one thing that really excites me is how can you affect change? Look out for the legal challenges now. We have this wonderful thing in Canada called the Charter of Rights and Freedom. It came into effect in 1982, and many social justice groups have been using it to further their causes. So judges are looking to use, Section 3, Section 5, Section 15, Section 7 to support minority rights or small group rights and individual rights. And this is an opportunity to get the courts, the Supreme Court of Canada, to support people's rights when it comes to voting and the need for choice in our electoral system. So that's what excites me actually, because there is a demographic change that's happening in society, and eventually the courts will reflect that. So, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, do some reading, learn about what's happening, and know that as Joanne said, if we don't use it, we will lose it. It's that simple. Democracy is one of the amazing things that we have in the Western world, and I always come to this simple fact here in Toronto, here in Ontario, even Canada, we have this wonderful society. We get along, people's rights are represented, our economy is strong, politically, it's very stable. Just think how much better we can govern ourselves if we had a more representative democratic and political system. Think about how easier life would be, um, you know, I won't even get into details, but just think about that. If we could solve our problems by working together, we would live a higher quality of life. And I'll leave it at that. So thank you, Simon. Thank you, the Green Party supporters. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, everyone else who showed up and supported. This has been a fantastic event. Let's have more of this. If you don't use it, you lose it, and let's work for change. Thank you.
And thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian Currie. Thank you, Joanne Roberts. Thank you, Dave Meslin, for being part of this panel discussion tonight. I've learned a lot, and I thought I knew a fair bit already. So I appreciate everything that you've brought to this. The webinar tonight has been recorded and it will get posted. We will let you know where you can find that. You can certainly follow our social media. It will be pushed out that way. And I suspect we'll probably reach out with a follow-up email with some of that information as well. We're going to be doing some parliamentary petitions to try to push our elected leaders to believe that electoral reform is important to Canadians. And there's a series of actions that will be coming up over the next few weeks and months. So with that, I see the time. It's 9:35 here in Ontario, and we've got some weather coming in, I understand. So if you've got weather coming in where you are, stay safe, stay warm, enjoy the rest of your evening, enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.